Good morning, welcome to another session in the process of examining the Welling-Hatfield Local Plan Development Plan document. This week is about examining the development management policies, nothing else, quite simple, that's all it is. And today we're going to be talking, thank you very much, we're going to be talking about strategic green infrastructure and depending how long that takes, it might be this afternoon, we'll be talking about infrastructure delivery and new schools. For those of you who have not been before, my name is Melvin Middleton. I'm an economist and a chartered town planner, and I've been appointed by the Secretary of State to hold this examination and to prepare a report on the DPD soundness for the Council. By way of introduction, this is my fifth examination into the development plan document. I worked for local authorities for almost 35 years, mainly on development plans, before joining the Inspectorate, where I've worked for the past 15 years. Within PINS, the consideration of appeals into housing, shopping, minerals, waste and viability matters at the moment take up most of my time when I'm not examining development plans. If you have any queries about the examination other than in response to what I'm about to say, or you want to contact me, please have a word with my programme officer, Louise St John Hart, who can be found normally on my right there. Can I stress that I quite clearly have to be impartial in my examination of this plan. I have never worked here. It's one of the few parts of the country actually where I haven't actually worked for PINS. I don't have any contact with the area, no relatives, no friends, etc. As well as actually being impartial, though, I have to be seen to be impartial. And so in that context, whilst I am a reasonably social animal, it's not really appropriate for people to wander up to me and start having individual conversations. If you want to have conversations with me, the best arranged with the programme officer, and you need somebody from the other side of the argument with you. If you've got a mobile phone, would you turn it off, please? Could the Council confirm whether there's going to be a fire drill today or not?
Not to my knowledge, sir, no.
Okay, thank you. So if it happens, we assemble in the car park at the back of the people sitting over there. If for whatever reason there's a fire preventing you getting out that way, then we go out the other way and assemble on the green at the other side of the road. If you've not signed the attendance list, would you sign it, please? It would act if there was a fire as a roll call as to who was there. So in that context, if there is a fire, please, if you've signed the attendance list, don't go wandering off to Waitrose or wherever for a cup of coffee. Do stop and have your name ticked off. Is anybody representing the press today? The people sitting around the table at some point will be wanting to speak. Could I ask you, when you speak for the first time, would you introduce yourself, indicate who you represent if you're not representing yourself, and assuming you're from somewhere in the vicinity of Welling-Hatfield, where you come from and what your basic interest in the examination is. Now, this hearing's not a planning appeal, and it's not a public inquiry into objections made to a plan. We no longer do that. The purpose of the hearing is to assist me in assessing the soundness of the development plan. The agendas therefore focus on the matters that I wish to hear more about, having read all the relevant documents, representations and responses. Where the parties have clearly stated their positions, and I believe that have sufficient information, then there might not be a specific item on the agenda. Having said that, people making representations have a right to be heard if they so wish, and some of the matters that are actually in the questions on the agenda stem from that. If there isn't a question that relates to what you're concerned about, then there will be a catch-all point at the end of each of the sessions and at the end of the day. However, the aim of my guidance note to eliminate repetition remains important. In line with current national policy, my starting point for the examination is the assumption that the Council has submitted what it considers to be a sound plan. Those of you that are seeking changes must demonstrate why it's unsound by reference to the test of soundness. I've set these out in a note which all participants should have a copy of. If not, the programme officer has got one, and they're also in the development plan section of the National Planning Policy Framework. If you consider an aspect of the plan to be unsound, I and the Council need to know the precise wording required in order, in your opinion, to make it sound. And that primarily is what today is all about. It's not really to sort of listen to people's views as to how, you know, this plan could be better if the Council were to do X, Y and Z. May not be the best plan that the Council could have produced, and again it might be. That's not really for me to judge. All I'm here to do is to test whether or not it's sound in the context of what the government has laid down as a test of soundness. So please focus your arguments on that. Anyone got any questions? As I've intimated, there has been a fair number of changes into the way development plans are examined over the last few years. In some respects, inspectors have perhaps got more detached from the process than they were before. We certainly don't have the degree of influence that we might once have had, which may not be a bad thing. The changes really that came from, first of all, the framework, but also the Channel and Country Planning England Regulations 2012, basically made it such that we can no longer recommend modifications that affect the soundness of the plan. Okay, even if we think in a particular area the plan is unsound, we can't specifically formally make recommendations. If I consider at the end of the day that the plan is unsound in any respect, my only course of action is to recommend that it's not adopted. Having said that, the Council do have an ability to formally ask me what I think is wrong with the plan, and if they do that, then I will obviously tell them. And there's obviously pointers coming out of today and the other examinations that we're having, and then, you know, the Council can go away and do whatever to make things sound. But again, you need to remember that just because something's unsound doesn't mean that there's just one solution to making it sound. There, in lots of instances, quite a number of ways you can change things to make them sound, and they're not all the same. Changes in the plan result in two ways. Firstly, if the Councils, on hearing the evidence and weight of arguments at the hearings, consider themselves that the plan is unsound in some respect or other, in these cases they might propose changes in principle at the hearing sessions in question, or at the round-up session, or even as is happening here before. That's by far the easiest way to proceed, and I hope the Council will continue to take this pragmatic approach to the examination, rather than seeking to maintain a defence to every proposal or last word in the policies, which does sometimes happen. Secondly, I myself, having heard the arguments and assessed the other evidence, consider an aspect of the plan to be unsound, in which case I will point this out verbally at the hearing sessions in question or at the round-up sessions, and if necessary elaborate about my concerns in writing. The Council then has the option of making changes to overcome the concerns, or convincing me that the plan is sound in a particular respect without changing. If there's no agreement, then the only alternative now is for me to find the plan unsound, in which case the Council don't adopt it, and to go back to go and start again. Minor changes are now referred to as additional modifications. They cover things like typos, grammatical mistakes, clarification matters, data information changes, phraseology improvements to the plan. Inspectors no longer have any responsibility for this, other than to agree that they do not affect the plan's soundness. Then they won't be a matter for me. And if you have concerns about the plan in any of those considerations, you should approach the Council directly about them. Anybody got any questions? Right, I've already read the evidence submitted by the respondents and the Council. There's a very comprehensive set of responses to all the questions, which I'm presuming you've all looked at on the website, and that's basically going to form the basis of the discussions today. What I want to know is, having read what the Council have said in response to the questions, you consider still to be unsound. You may not agree with it. That's not the issue. Do you find it unsound? And if you do, why? Having read all the evidence, it means that there's no need for people to verbatim read their statements out to the examination. They're all on the website. Anybody who wanted to read them could have read them. So the format is a discussion, basically, questions and answers, and different points of argument put forward. We will go through each question on the agenda as appropriate in order, and I'll invite people to contribute to the discussion as we move on, really on the basis of what they've said in their representations. I would welcome relevant comments and questions from any of you as the discussion progresses. If you want to speak, please stand up the Toblerones to attract my attention if you wish to say something. Please note that unless I specifically agree to it, there will be no cross-examination. I don't think we've got any barristers apart from the one sitting on my left today, and he tends not to cross-examine people. But you know, please do put questions to one another in a polite, formal way. I'll take part in the discussion as well as chairing it. Please remember that my job is to challenge the soundness of the entire plan, not just those parts about which people have made representations. I also have to write a comprehensive report that fully explains why certain aspects of the plan have needed to be changed to make them sound, while other parts are considered sound by me and do not require change despite, the weight of views of others. In order to do this, I need to equip myself with a comprehensive set of evidence that has been tested and justifies my conclusions. In some instances, I'll act as devil's advocate in order to test the robustness of parts of the plan that other people have not questioned. In such instances, I'll not necessarily be expressing my own opinions. At other times, I will be expressing the views of third parties who have chosen for all sorts of valid reasons not to be present again today. What I'm saying there, again, won't necessarily be my own opinions, so please don't take anything I say to imply that that's what I'm thinking about this examination, because you might be totally wide of the mark. There's been an unusually large amount of representation against this plan. If the examination is not to be excessively prolonged, then it's more than vital than usual that it remains focused on the considerations that affect its soundness. I'll therefore interrupt participants who appear to me to be going off message. I hope politely, but as I come from a different part of the country from most of you, and where people's language is perhaps a bit more blunt, please don't take offence at anything I say, because none is certainly intended. Despite pointing out that the current set of hearings are about development management policies and the principal areas of evidence that feed into that, there has been a considerable amount of further evidence, despite what I've said in the past, from some participants about specific sites. That's not been helpful, as wasted time that, given the weight of the representations against this plan, I can ill afford to waste. I don't wish to hear evidence about specific sites again until I examine the sites at a future set of hearings. That said, if it is appropriate to refer to sites to help to explain a wider point, in that case, I would ask you not to refer to sites in which you have a professional interest, but choose sites where you're not directly involved in order to make what are general points about these development management policies. If any of you do raise specific matters that are not addressed to addressing development management policies, then I'll ask you to end your participation. I'm not sure how long the current session is going to take. I suspect it will probably go on beyond 11:30. If that is the case and it doesn't look as though it's going to be wound up pretty soon after, then I'll take a break at an appropriate point, and then we'll have to come back and conclude the session. I'd hope to break for lunch before 1 o'clock, and I aim to complete the afternoon's business before 5. You should all have copies of the agenda. Anybody who hasn't, if you ask Louise for one, she'll no doubt give you one. Are there any questions at this stage of the hearing? Okay, right. Well, first of all, we're going to be examining policy SP12, Strategic Green Infrastructure, where I've set out quite a lot of questions that have effectively come from the representations that were made. We'll go through them one by one. As I say, the Council have produced quite comprehensive responses to all of them. In some instances, they've made suggested changes. What I want to know from you is if you think, no matter what the Council have said, the policy is still unsound, why it's unsound, and how it should be changed. So, first of all, does the policy adequately define and promote the fundamental role of green infrastructure in maximising sustainable development? So presumably everybody agrees that it does. Is the policy consistent with the definition and understanding of green infrastructure as set out in the National Planning Practice Guidance? Yep. Should there be better referencing of inter-authority network of green infrastructure? No, so that's fine. Should the policy explain and promote the multifunctional uses and benefits of green infrastructure? Does the policy give sufficient emphasis to the role that cycling can play in sustainable movement? Has sufficient attention been paid to the value of green infrastructure to cycling and its overall health benefits? I'm going to be through by 11 o'clock at this rate. Should new development be required to meet the standards for the provision of public open space set out in the planning obligations supplementary planning document? Should river basin management plans, guidance and the water framework directive be referred to in this policy? We had a long discussion about this yesterday. You want to go back into it?
No, no, I don't, sir. Just to say that there was one outstanding issue from the discussion yesterday regarding costs and infrastructure in the inclusion of that. So whenever you want to raise that point, I'd just like to raise that back again, if I may, sir.
You're talking about the actual cost of implementing it?
The costs of the various measures, programs of measures that the water industry will need to take into account.
The infrastructure delivery aspect.
Okay, if we could deal with it whenever you want, sir.
No, deal with it then.
Thank you.
I mean, the policy is not unsound because of that. Is too much development being proposed in the Welling-Hatfield Green Corridor to maintain existing natural assets, including its wildlife, and to enable enhancement to be achieved? I can't read your Toblerone, but Mr. Ward?
Yes, Nick Ward, Gascoigne Cecil Estates, and I'm employed by JB Planning Associates. Our concern with this particular, or in response to this particular question, and in particular the denotion of the green corridor, or the green gap, relates primarily to how it's shown on Figure 8. We consider that the denotion of the green corridor is shown to be far too thinly to be effective. And there's a concern, whilst that diagram is a diagram and it is intended to be shown diagrammatically, there's an inevitable risk, I suppose, that people will consider what is denoted should be then subsequently interpreted into detailed proposals. And so to provide greater clarity to the plan and to sort of meet those tests of soundness which you're concerned with, we would suggest that the drawing that we've attached to our initial representations perhaps represents a more realistic denotion of that green corridor.
Someone from the council wish to respond?
Thanks, Bryce Subble, Hatfield Council. I mean, I think it's appropriate. The diagram should be schematic for the purpose of the local plan. Within the policy SB12, the council has set out its intention to produce a supplementary planning document to provide further guidance in relation to the green corridor. And I think we consider that would be the appropriate place to put further detail around the green corridor, and that will be sort of subject to further evidence gathering and consultation with the relevant stakeholders.
So at this point in time, you don't think there should be sort of a parameter of a minimum width or something like that in it then?
That's broadly correct, yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Leary?
Good morning. Gary O'Leary. I'm Central Hearts Green Corridor Group. I'm also chairman of the local parish council in Hartingfordbury. My comment here would be that I think it's an impossible question to answer whether there's too much development being proposed. And the reason I say that is because, and it'll come up at later points, is I don't think all of the potential constraints on development with regard to ecological values and the ecological assets through the corridor and the interconnection of those corridors have been assessed to an extent that you could answer this question about whether there's too much development. And that, I think, is one of the shortcomings in soundness terms.
You can't say the council haven't done anything. Are you saying they haven't done enough?
Correct, yes. I'd say that as you're probably aware, there was a desktop survey done by the parish council which looked at species and habitats. And I think at this point, the council haven't done enough to actually ascertain or answer the question about whether there's too much development. That desktop survey we did, or the parish council did, identified a number of species, a number of levels of connectivity, and a number of habitats. And I don't believe it would be sound to be able to suggest a level of development without that being fully followed through. And I know it all talks about it downstream, further engagement, further master planning, further surveys, but my supposition would be that at this stage it would be very difficult to answer that question without the full level of assessment have being done. And I don't think the assessment either by developers or councils have actually gone to the level that you could reasonably answer that question.
Given that you're going to the extent of saying how many dwellings will be delivered on a number of strategic sites, I mean in particular Birchfield Garden Suburb and Northwest Hatfield, don't you really need to know before you can make that judgment how much land is actually going to be needed for, in that instance, non-residential uses? Because you can't make the calculation, can you, otherwise?
I think the calculation of the yield of those sites is broadly reasonable having regard to those constraints. Of course, the information will develop and evolve as we proceed through the master planning process. And I think that's why the master planning process is key. But to have absolute certainty at this stage, I don't think that that's possible, sir.
No, but you know, if your green corridor through these sites was 50, 100 or 200 metres wide, it would have fundamental impacts on the amount of housing you'd get on them. So, I mean, you must have made a judgment. Well, I hope you have.
I think, yes, we have had a judgment. We have had regard to potential constraints as part of the HELAR process, which was responsible for helping decide upon the dwellings that could be yielded from those sites. We've also started some detailed master planning discussions with a number of the major landowners promoted sites within the corridor. So, yes, we are aware of those, and we are confident that those dwelling numbers can be accommodated having regard to those constraints. But there will need to be a process of sort of further evidence gathering, consultation to decide things such as detailed layout, buffers and the like. And that will be informed by detailed ecological assessments which have been produced in the case of Birchfield Garden Suburb, which you've already heard, and will be prepared in support of other strategic sites within the corridor.
I mean, it might be something that we have to return to when we discuss, you know, some of the strategic sites again. But I mean, it strikes me if you've assumed, let's say, that it's going to be a 50-metre wide belt, and then you do your surveys, and that is just not environmentally sustainable in terms of having a corridor for wildlife to pass through, and you end up having to double or triple it, then you're going to make fundamental changes to the numbers of dwellings these sites are delivering, which is going to make fundamental changes to, you know, the overall total that we can provide. I mean, didn't that ought to be in the public domain for discussion at this point in time?
I think there will always be an element of uncertainty around the ultimate dwelling number to be yielded from those sites. Certainly, given the size of those sites, there are things which can be done to manage dwelling yield. There may be parts of the site where it's maybe not appropriate to deliver any development at all, but there may be opportunities elsewhere in those sites to deliver higher density to ensure that you get that average yield across the entire site.
Well, okay, let's look at it another way. You've got quite precise figures for these sites in the list of development sites. Have they been arrived at? I mean, has there been any input from, if you like, the green corridor aspect of it, or have you just said, well, we've got, 100 hectares at whatever number of dwellings per hectare gross tends to be achieved, we'll just multiply the two together?
Thank you. The HELA did not actually take account of the strategic green corridor in terms of its capacity, but we applied a sort of consistent approach across all the sites. If there was a designated a wildlife site or some site of ecological interest, instead of detailing a buffer on the advice of Hearts Ecology, our approach was to agree that there would need to be some buffering, but at this level we revised the capacity down. So we had, just to sort of broadly, obviously you can read the detail in the HELA, but we had different capacities depending on the size of the site, sort of trying to take into account the need. For the larger the site, you'd have a 25 dwelling per hectare site size because there'd be more infrastructure. So where there was something such as a logical asset or flooding or a heritage asset, we sort of revised the capacity down to 20% to give a broad indication. So we applied that approach consistently with the concept that sort of detailed agreements on buffering would be taken forward in the master planning and through detailed planning application level discussions.
Yeah, I'm not sure that actually gets us where we need to be, because they're not insignificant areas of land that are going through, as we saw at Birchall the other week. And I mean, the actual green corridor through North West Hearts is even bigger.
So if it would be helpful, we could give you an estimate of dwelling capacity based on looking at the developable areas, excluding the green corridor, just to confirm the figures, if that would assist.
I think so. I mean, the other way is basically, I can understand why you've, not gone into lots of detail. You've not got time. I mean, I personally fully appreciate that. But that said, there really maybe should be a sort of minimum parameter that gets fed into your master plans, that, at least it shouldn't be any narrower than whatever.
I think
because otherwise, you'll end up doing the master planning and you'll have said that we're going to put 1,500 dwellings or whatever on this site, and that will be the starting point. What's left over, having put 1,500 dwellings on?
We did consult on the Stage 1 Green Corridor framework there, and in that document we identified a minimum width for the Green Corridor of being 50 metres plus 5 metres for any footpaths or cycleways. And that was subject to consultation. I believe that was, I'm not aware that there were any objection to that particular dimension. In some cases we think the corridor would need to be wider than that in order to protect wildlife assets, or at least to give the opportunity of enhancing biodiversity. I know Heart Ecology certainly had concerns that 50 metres could be too narrow in certain places, and that would be a pinch point in their words. So I think I wouldn't like to indicate that it will be 50 metres wide, because I think in some places we would want something substantially wider than that.
Okay, well, can I ask you just to have a rethink about that? And if you think that 50 metres is reasonably certain, then at the very least you could put that, the green corridor should be at least 50 metres. And that's not to say it can't be 200 metres, but, it can't be like 25 metres. I mean, I've seen green corridors that are, the same sort of thing elsewhere, where people try to sort of thumbnail them through housing developments, and, they're narrower than this room.
I think that would be helpful to say it should be no narrower than something.
Yeah. Do you want to say something else?
I just wanted to make one comment, and there's lots of stakeholders have been contributing and commenting at different points in this. I think it comes down to the adequacy of the evidence base that's being used, and that this corridor has been highlighted since 2009 at different times for different reasons around a potential for development and the potential constraints, and the allocation of such large scale without the adequate evidence base is the major concern, because as you say, when you get down to the detail, it might be that there are quite serious constraints that would make that level of allocation impossible.
Okay. I can't quite see your name.
Thank you, sir. It's Andrew Winterskill for David Locke Associates for Tarmac. Yes, if I can just reassure you concerning Birchall Garden Suburb, as you heard on the 30th of January, that particular site benefits from 10 years of master planning work and significant consultation and engagements, particularly in the last 3 to 4 years. It also benefits from a full suite of ecological surveys, which you've seen, which were submitted to you before the Birchall hearing. In terms of the parameters and issues that you raised, we've assumed a net density of 30 dwellings per hectare. We have assumed a minimum width for the green corridor of 50 metres, a minimum width, I emphasise, and those parameters yield a capacity of 1,200 dwellings within Welwyn Hatfield, as allocated, and 1,350 dwellings within East Herts, which gets us to the 2550 for BGS as a strategic holistic site. So I can reassure you that it has been well considered. The parameters have informed that master planning work over a very extended period, over a 10-year period, and have fed into Welwyn Hatfield's own evidence and analysis. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Ward, do you want to say something else?
Thank you, sir. And just mindful of some of the comments which were made by 2 or 3 speakers ago in relation to the role of master plans and the incorporation of green space within the master planning process for any given site. As you heard from me yesterday, the policy that we dealt with on SP9 in terms of placemaking does not require, as it's currently drafted, the need for visions and objectives to be clearly established and articulated. And I think as a consequence of that absence, if we then move on to the provision of green infrastructure, effectively the visioning work which would actually enable meaningful gaps to be provided, and from a personal perspective, 50 metres is neither here nor there in terms of its usefulness from a sort of ecological connection point of view. There's clearly a need for a better and clearer definition of what is meant by that green corridor, and to make it of a meaningful width. Welwyn Garden City itself is set within a very well-treed sort of backdrop. The gap effectively between the A414 and the edge of the town is of a consistent width, which contributes, as you have heard I'm sure in other sessions, to the sort of character of this particular area, and it's important as a gap between settlements in terms of the green belt function. So it's imperative that we have a meaningful gap and a meaningful corridor actually provided between the respective settlements to actually act in to perform a function in ecological and landscape terms, which I'm sure people to my right are much more have better knowledge than I do in terms of the importance of maintaining the field connections and other such features.
Mr. Oakenfold?
Thanks, Joe. Peter Oakenfold, local ecologist, and I sort of represent various part of the mammal group and local bird bringers. And in 10 years, I consider that we would be a significant local stakeholder. And in 10 years, this is just responding to the gentleman from Tarmac, is that we have never been consulted in that period, either by Tarmac, as he pointed out that he represented, or Welling Hatfield Borough Council. And we hold significant data which would not show up on ecological mapping that this is based on. The evidence that they talk about is the ecological mapping through Hertfordshire.
I don't want to go back into Birchall Garden suburb if that's what you put in your hand up for. How the consultations have gone forward, I mean, unless it's really legally a problem, I aren't going there.
I just wanted to very briefly correct that particular point, just to say that
yeah,
we have sought to engage Mr. Oakenfold, but he hasn't engaged with us. We have sought to engage with him.
Well, you know, that's not a matter for me whether you have or you haven't. Okay, Mr. Maddox.
David Maddox, Arlington Business Park. I want to pick up on the point about the adequacy of the evidence base supporting the policy. And I've written this in my representations, that in my view, the policy is unsound, particularly on the Green Corridor, because the evidence base is out of date. The Green Infrastructure Plan is from 2011, and since that time there has been significant amount of evidence on the opportunities that exist along certain parts of that Green Corridor that have not been taken into account. And the MPPG does not only just require for the existing situation to be analysed, and also the gaps, the existing gaps, but also the opportunities that exist to enhance green infrastructure.
So what's not been taken into account?
The opportunities that exist at Ellenbrook Fields.
Well, given that there's no development proposed there, what's the issue?
I think there is an opportunity to improve Ellenbrook Fields, but there are consequential effects of doing so for other modifications to the plan.
Yes, I know, but I mean, what the policy is doing is basically saying that we want a green corridor, and this is what the green corridor is going to do. If you like, the angle I'm coming from is nothing else should happen in the plan to make that not possible. Which is why I was saying, well, how wide is this corridor going to be, and what's the ramifications for the major sites? I mean, if you were expecting a full analysis of all the areas where this goes through what is currently open countryside, then A, it would take an awful long time, and B, it would almost usurp the detailed master plan, wouldn't it?
Well, my view is that the policies should be more in sync and a bit more holistic than that. So, for example, if there is an objective to create a green corridor, and it is a strategic objective to do so, then it's the duty of the local authority to look at the opportunities that exist to do that, and if that involves consequential impacts on other policies relating to housing and transport and everything else, then so be it. But the point is that the real opportunities for the green corridor have not been examined fully.
Well, why would there be? I mean, this is not a green corridor plan. It's not an implementation plan. I mean, it's just setting the marker down. We want a green corridor.
Yes, but the MPPG says in doing so, they should look fully at what opportunities exist to do that, and that may have consequential effects on other policies in the plan.
Well, yeah, which is where I was coming from, and where I presume Mr. O'Leary was coming from. That, you know, there are major development areas proposed along the alignment of this green corridor, and well, the council already said they will relook at that. And we had, I don't know if you were there, but we had a long debate about it when we were talking about Birchall Garden suburb.
Yes, but it is also using development opportunities in order to create opportunities along the green corridor, and not just looking at development as a constraint within the green corridor. So using development to improve the opportunities that haven't yet been fully examined. We should use development elsewhere. We should use development as a tool to promote green infrastructure throughout the borough.
Well, yes, but it has to fit into the overall jigsaw, doesn't it? I mean, you know, you just can't look at it in isolation. I mean, I'm not going to go into why or why not, you know, your site's not being allocated, because it's not before me. But given that it's not been allocated, I'm not sure where the argument takes you. It's there. As it is now, there are no proposals to change it, so if in the fullness of time, when somebody does a green corridor plan and they decide that there should be an element of the green corridor that requires some infrastructure on that site of whatever description, then that's the time to deal with it. I mean, there's nothing prejudiced it. You won't be building houses all over it unless this plan changes. The council wants to comment.
Sorry, it was just to reassure Mr. Maddox that the Green Infrastructure Plan does actually make reference to opportunities associated with Ellenbrook Fields Country Park. So that is recognised in the Green Infrastructure Plan.
There you go. Again, it's Mr. Dodds, isn't it? Yeah, I can't see the bottom of your name.
Thank you, sir. I thought it would be useful to just consider the science behind wildlife corridors and movement corridors and minimum widths and what have you. As you can imagine, we would like the Wildlife Trust to make sure that all corridors are as wide as they possibly can be, so that they're as functional as they possibly can be. So in the course of a long period of time, we've looked into some sort of justification for corridor widths. Now, this is involved in sort of a large trawl through the primary scientific literature, as you would imagine, for some sort of justification that we could then influence plan making on. And the truth is, whilst virtually every single study will tell you the wider the corridor, the better it is, when you're looking at empirical distances and minimum widths, which is really the critical thing for corridors such as this, to get anybody to pin their name to a minimum width is extraordinarily difficult. The best I've managed to come up with is a study into salamanders and wood frogs in America, which are a proxy for amphibian movements in this country, and that says that the typical meandering distance of those species is 50 meters. That is pretty much, and this is then once things get into the literature, they tend to get repeated. Now that then has become the minimum distance or the recommended distance for crossings of roads, etc. So like a wildlife bridge, but it's based on that study. So in terms of justification for a minimum width, it's very difficult. It is extremely difficult. It depends on so many things. The first point that you should have when you're looking at movement corridors is what's there. What's it going to facilitate the movement of? And once it falls below a certain distance, will it stop being functional? Now, in terms of the green corridor, the argument is, and has been presented by ecological consultants, that probably the most vulnerable to being isolated in terms of movements would be a terrestrial animal, a slow-moving terrestrial animal, i.e. wood frogs and salamanders, or great-crested newts and toads, say, for example, in this instance. So there is the difficulty, because I think you're dead right. It's extraordinarily helpful to set minimum distances, and a lot of our representations further on in this plan will involve minimum distances because they add clarity. So this is the rub. So Welland Hatfield have set this 50-metre boundary width, and immediately the developer's gone, right, it's 50 metres. And that's what happens. As soon as, if you don't set a minimum width of movement corridor, then the edges get eroded and it ceases to become functional. So the setting of a minimum distance is extraordinarily helpful. The scientific veracity behind that minimum distance is questionable, but the one thing you can say is that the wider it is, the better it will function, because all reports say that. Pretty much everything, even down to birds. Something as mobile as birds, you would think they would be unaffected by movement corridors, but they are, and the scientific literature will support that. So we're sort of left in this conundrum where you have to evidence everything you say and every change in the plan that you would like. But the position we're in is that I feel, and the Trust feels, that the figure 8 that was referred to earlier provides a corridor that people are expecting. And then to change that from, which is ostensibly probably about 300 metres, is it? 300 metre corridor, the Trust will know this better. Sorry, the Gascoigne Cecil Estate. I think it's about 300 metre corridor. Now, that's what people are expecting. Now, all of a sudden, when the plans appear for whichever development it might be, show a 50 metre corridor, then that's sort of not the plan that people were consulted on. And that's pretty much my point.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, it's all right. Yes, Mr. Fisher, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Yeah, I'd just like to agree with a lot of what Mr. Dodds has just said in terms that the dangers and risks and lack of evidence behind any specific measure based on a specific frog or whatever. I think to answer the question as to how wide the corridor should be, you need to look at the whole gamut of what the impacts are, what the assets are, and what the services that they deliver, both can deliver and what would be impacted positively or negatively. And that's what we did in the report we've provided for you. And our assessment, and we were advised by professors at the St Albans end of our corridor, that you double the width of the corridor, you get double the benefits, and that needs to be spelt out. So I think I agree with Mr. Dodds that it's not simple and evident, and you need to be very careful that a 50-metre statutory measure is a very imperfect and poorly based measure, and you need to assess the full evidence base behind it. And Mr. Leary's questions about the adequacy of that has to be taken into account in determining what that corridor should be and how it then is applied, and what the implications that you're rightly raising, sir, about it for the number of houses accordingly. Thank you.
Okay. All right. We basically answered 94 along with 93 and almost 95. I mean, does anybody want to comment on has a holistic assessment of the cumulative effects of developments on the ecological environment and the green corridor been undertaken? You no doubt tell me it hasn't.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, we've looked hard at this question, and to our mind, it just follows on from what I said earlier. The width should be determined, and there's a number of factors that should go into that, and there's a mosaic of various factors. You start with a mapping of the corridor, the recreation options, the constraints in terms of ecology, and we've had a go at trying to do that, which we can share with you if you want, that gives you a view as to how wide that should be, but effectively it is an issue of relation to what is the various services mapped onto each other that can assess that, and maybe my colleagues can give you more detail on that if you want.
I mean, you know, it's really for you to give to the council, really, rather than myself, if you think it's of use to them.
Happy to do that.
Okay. The last one's Ellenbrook Country Park, which I think we've just touched on. Do you want to say anything more about it?
Only a small bit. It's just I do agree with the council on this point. It doesn't need to be designated on the proposals map because it's really it has very limited public access. I think it's misleading, to be honest, to call it a country park. It is actually on figure 8 identified as Ellenbrook Fields, and it's nowhere near a country park. It doesn't have any of the facilities that an accredited country park would have. It could have, of course, but it doesn't at the moment, and therefore it shouldn't be designated on the proposals map.
What's your definition of a country park?
The same as the government's definition of a country park.
Okay.
In our representations. You have to have accreditation to be a country park, and there's a full list of essential and desired criteria. This is nowhere near a country park. Absolutely not. I mean, it's called Ellenbrook Fields. Unfortunately, on figure 8, it's called Ellenbrook Fields. I'm not sure I'd go that far either, to be honest, but there you go. Probably call it Ellenbrook Scrubs or something.
Well, whatever. If it's got paths across and people can walk the dogs, is it not?
It's got permissive paths.
Well, yeah. So does it not fulfilling the recreational function?
It fulfills a recreational function, but it's not a country park. That's slightly misleading. But the question is, should
like
it be
science
designated
parks,
on the
though,
proposals
isn't it?
map?
You know, I mean, there's the names attached to all sorts of things. All the colliery tips in North Nottinghamshire, by and large, are called country parks. But all it is somebody's put topsoil and trees on them and footpaths.
I don't think it's. I agree with the council. It should not be designated on the proposals map. It doesn't warrant that status.
All right. I don't think anyone's saying it should be, are they?
Your question did.
Okay, go on.
Thank you, sir. Simon Chivers, Principal Planner, Welwyn Hatfield Council. I think Mr. Maddox is right in the sense that we're not proposing, as set out in our statement, that there should be a specific allocation on the policies map. There is a reason for this, in that the Ellenbrook Park, and that was its original title and originally referred to when it first came into being as a concept and as a proposal associated with the redevelopment of adjoining land, which includes Hatfield Business Park. Ellenbrook Park is already something that is in process for delivery following planning permission section 106 agreement dating back to 2000. So essentially it's something which already, well before this current plan that's before you came for consideration, has been in the process of delivery and is still currently in the process of delivery. Having said that, I'm surprised a little at Mr. Maddox sort of playing down his client's treatment of the park, because it has been open as such and well used as an informal recreation facility since about 2010. So the reason we're not, if you like, proposing a specific allocation, as indeed we haven't proposed an allocation on the map for the other two parks that are mentioned in policy SB12, is because it's coming forward and has been coming forward for some time, will continue to do so through a slightly different route. I think the point about government guidance, whilst I note that Mr. Maddox in his representations has produced a very long list of points that are made in the government guidance about what is a country park, the park complies with quite a number of those and not others. It is in a sense an academic sort of issue, because it's a real facility, it's a real entity on the ground to which people are enjoying access, and there will be ongoing process of enhancement, handing over to a trust, etc., under the existing section 106 agreement. What we are proposing in point K of our hearing statement, and this is also in response to points made by St Albans Council, who were, I think, were originally on the list to be represented today, within whose area part of the park lies, is a minor sort of change in wording to the section of the policy. It's actually in the middle. It's the middle of the policy, which is quite long, as you know. So under Welwyn Hatfield Green Corridor section of the policy, the second paragraph under there, we're proposing, as set out in our statement, to insert in the second part of that paragraph, which starts in particular, the Council will work with Hertfordshire County Council and St Albans District Council as a joining authority, and then to insert the words to secure the delivery of Ellenbrook Fields Country Park. I agree there's an issue, and there has been for years, and there probably will be for a while longer, about what exactly it is called, and maybe at some point there needs to be an agreement on that. But insert the wording to secure the delivery of Ellenbrook Fields Country Park, and then to maintain appropriate and safe public access to the country park. So, if you like, we're recognising the point that delivery is in progress, but to say, as Mr Matz implies, that at the moment it's, I think, what do you call it, scrubs, and following, which I think is what he's saying, following any allocation for housing within part of that land that would by definition remove a substantial chunk of it, that it could be enhanced. I think it's a slightly curious sort of argument, really, but that's just hopefully clarified the council's position.
Okay. Just one point before we leave this. If you actually compare figure 8, which is the Green Corridor plan, with figure 14, which is HAP 1, figure 14 on the northern part of the site's got an area of green belt which doesn't seem to sort of come through, if I've read the plan properly, onto the Green Corridor plan. Perhaps need to look at that. Being devil's advocate, it strikes me, listening to what's been said this morning and also listening to what was said at Birchall Garden Suburb, that there probably is a conflict between, corridors that will support a wide variety of wildlife and, if you like, the minimum 50 metres, and also the needs of, of humans going through walking and cycling, etc. And it just struck me that, going through some of these large sites, is it worth thinking about maybe having a wildlife corridor outside, so you do improvements to farmers' fields and all these sorts of things to, get habitats, etc. And you leave the parts that are going through the urban, what will be an urban area, as, if you like, the sort of areas of human movement. But I don't know.
We're certainly aware of the tension.
Yeah.
But also what we wanted to do was to give people access to open space, the countryside. That was also part of the objectives. So when we talked about the minimum width being 50 metres, we also allowed an additional 5 metres for any footpath, cycleway to address that as an issue. But I think that is something that we will need to look at in more detail. Also to think about the type of habitat that's being created along the corridor, because I think some types of habitat don't need quite as much protection as other types of habitat, and that's a detail that I think will need to be looked at in a bit more detail when we prepare the SPD for the Green Corridor.
Okay, Mr. O'Leary?
Yeah, just on that, to comment on your comment, Inspector. The Central Hearts Green Corridor Group have been working with the Hearts Local Access Forum on this particular question of what are the reasonable and sensible routes for people as well as wildlife in the corridor, and we'd be more than happy to share that and discuss that with the council, because that balance has to be struck correctly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, I know it's great for people to go and mix among wildlife, and certainly for young people to learn about it all, but I mean, humans are probably the wildlife's worst enemies if you look at what's happened over the last 50 years.
And we believe there are some great opportunities for providing appropriate routes through the corridor and balancing that with the wildlife aspect. So I think, and that's, I think, the important part of next steps in terms of how you deliver the green infrastructure.
Mr. Ward?
Thank you. Again, a comment on your comment, in so much as as you've identified, for those allocations to the west of the borough, SD6 and SDS5, there are opportunities clearly to extend wildlife corridors perhaps around those allocations, in addition to including a wide and very meaningful gap through them. But if you contrast that then with those allocations which exist to the east of the borough, and in particular SDS2, the presence of the 414, which acts as a very physical barrier at the moment to wildlife, means that those opportunities do not exist in the same way, because we're not dealing with surrounding open land. There's a very, very physical barrier, which sort of comes back to the point I was making earlier about the need for that green corridor to be very wide and meaningful, and not at a specified distance, which will ultimately be, rather than interpreted as a minimum, will actually become the maximum, and not achieve the objectives which I'm sure the council are trying to secure, which is a sort of healthy green lung through this particular part of the borough. Thank you.
Okay. Right. No, anyone's got anything else to say? No? We'll move on to SADM 15 Heritage. Oh, the first one is why scheduled monuments referred to as historic monuments. Is there a reason for that? I'm not quite sure where. I can't remember where the question came from. Somebody must have raised it.
It was an issue. It was Historic England who've raised it, and we've agreed to a modification to correct that.
Okay, so it is scheduled monuments. All right. Does the policy adequately reflect national guidance in paragraph 134 of the MPPF? I think that's English Heritage again, isn't it? Have you reached an accommodation with them on all this now?
We have agreed to a modification to the policy. I think that probably occurred after we signed the MOU. Not quite sure. We're just checking to see if they've agreed to that wording. If they haven't, then we'll make sure they're happy with that wording.
You've crossed will also be refused unless the need for out in as a minor modification.
I think that was because it didn't. It went further than the requirements set out in the MPPF, and so the changes we were trying to introduce were perhaps to more correctly reflect the weight given in national planning policy framework. Okay, just to confirm, it was subsequent to the Memorandum of Understanding with Historic England, so I can confirm. I will check with them that they are happy with that.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. Has sufficient attention been paid to National Planning Policy Guidance and Historic England's Good Practice Guide 3 when considering the role of setting in the determination of the significance of a heritage asset? Yeah.
Nigel Barker-Mills, Gascoigne Cecil Estates, heritage consultant. The two questions, actually, the amended wording for 134 is actually the wording that is in the NPPF, so the suggested wording complies with that. But the point that we would like to make is that the policy says, should consider the following, which is not really reflecting the importance of the historic environment that the government has identified in the NPPF, where, of course, it's great weight that should be given to the preservation, the protection, the conservation of the historic environment. And although there is the repetition of policies 133, paragraphs 133 and 134 in the supporting text reflect what the NPPF says, actually the starting point is the avoidance of harm. So we have suggested to the Council a different wording for the policy which starts from that very basis, which is great weight will be given to the conservation of the historic environment, which is the fundamental objective set out in the NPPF. And we feel that's much clearer than the policy wording, and in fact is much more robust and effective. It will be clearer for anyone trying to adhere to the procedure, to the SADM 15. They'll understand where the Council is coming from. And with regard to setting, although I note that that some suggestions have been made by Historic England in terms of adding in wording, I still feel that with setting, because it is so complicated, you need to nail the fact that setting is not an asset in itself. It's not there to be appreciated. Its importance is the contribution it makes to the significance of the asset, of the principal asset, which is why in our suggested wording for the policy you will see that every time setting is referenced, it's contribution that setting makes. So again, that guides people who want to put in applications as to what they should be considering and how they should be presenting the evidence for the Council to make their decisions. And of particular concern is the phrase in the supporting text which refers to appreciation of setting. It's not, that implies setting is an asset in its own right, and that's simply incorrect.
Does the Council want to say anything?
Yes, thank you, sir. As we discussed yesterday, Policy SP11 does set out the importance of the historic environment, and therefore I think that's where the importance given to avoiding harm is placed. SADM 15 is intended to set out the criteria for considering planning applications and clearly needs to be considered together with Policy SP11. I do think, though, perhaps the opening sentence which says the proposal should consider the following actually might be better to be strengthened to say should address the following, to make it clear that those are matters which need to be taken into account when proposals are coming forward. There are a number of references in the policy to the contribution setting makes to the asset, and we have proposed some minor modifications or modifications to the policy just to strengthen that it's the setting of the asset. I'm wondering whether just to clarify the issues relating to setting, whether the supporting text would benefit from just a section on setting, just to perhaps go into a bit more detail on the value of the setting and that it's not just views, which I know is another point that you've made as well.
I mean, his point's right. It isn't, if you like, the setting in its own right. It's what the setting does to the building that you should be considering.
Yes, and I think if we had a section in the supporting text which just clarified that, then I think that would make that point. So.
All right, can I just ask then, I mean, you've presumably got some representations from them, just to have a re-look at it all.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
The next one, is it sufficiently clear as to what controls are to be put in place to regulate development in order to preserve and enhance the character and appearance of Welwyn Garden City, which is an internationally recognised site? That's come out of the Welwyn Garden City Society, who can't be here. presume you still think this is okay?
We do, sir. We think it's a combination of policies. So there's this specific policy on heritage, but then there is a specific policy in the Welwyn Garden City section of the plan, which sets out an approach for proposals coming forward in Welwyn Garden City.
Okay. We talked about the next one at length yesterday.
So just
why
before...
is there no reference to... Sorry, go on. Do you want to talk about Welwyn Garden City?
Yeah, just before we leave, the risk of repetition, which I know you don't want, it just goes to the discussion we had yesterday about the benefits of having a dedicated strategic policy on the historic environment, because the historic environment is so various in its forms, and that would give you the framework to be dealing and drawing out the importance of the different nature of the heritage assets you've got. I know you've chosen and you've explained why you haven't gone down that route, but I'm just giving another push to say it really could be considered, because there are many benefits, and it would aid the effectiveness and clarity of the plan in our view. That's the only bit of repetition I wanted to make before we went on to the next one.
Yeah, well, unless it's really fundamental in terms of clarity of plan, and whether it could be made a better plan, is not somewhere I can go.
I understand that.
All right, so you need to talk to council separately about it. All right. Did you want to say anything else then about locally listed buildings, or did we come to a satisfactory conclusion yesterday? I mean, the council were going to relook at certainly the wording of the policy. Okay. Right, 104. Without a mechanism requiring sites with the potential to contain heritage assets to be adequately assessed, how can the policy be fully effective at conserving the historical environment? I think this came out of the County Council's archaeology people.
I think we also discussed
this yesterday.
We did, and what I agreed to do was to liaise with them to check that they were happy with the modification.
Okay. Right, it's 11:20. There's rather a lot on ecology and landscape. It seems an appropriate time to break, so we'll break till 12. Yeah, we're talking about ecology and landscape. First question, to achieve measurable net gains to biodiversity, should applicants be encouraged to use expert ecological and landscape consultants when preparing material to support planning applications? Does the Council want to respond to that?
Thank you, Sir. Laura Guy from the Council. I think we consider that we do support that, and we outline in the supporting text that we would expect expert ecological and landscape consultants to work on the preparation of proposals, and that also we would encourage sort of the use of early pre-app advice, design review and consultation with our own ecological experts at the Council. Thank you.
Anybody want to comment? No? In achieving a net overall gain to biodiversity, shouldn't compensatory habitat replacement be on-site as well as off-site? Anybody wish to say anything?
Just to say, we agree with that, and we've made a minor modification to change that.
Okay.
Or a modification.
Again, we're back to what we talked about yesterday. Should the policy define measures by which the impacts of development on habitats and biodiversity can be effectively measured and assessed? I presume Mr. doesn't want to go through it again. I think we came to a conclusion. Mr. Fisher on the board as well.
If you want me to go on, I will, but otherwise I think I've said enough yesterday ad infinitum.
Does the Council want to add anything?
No, I think we're happy, thank you.
Okay. Again, we're on to what we talked about earlier in 109. Should minimum dimensions for wildlife buffer strips be stipulated in the plan? You're going to wait to look at that anyway. As far as the green corridor is concerned, I suspect it would apply elsewhere.
Potentially. I think the sort of our thinking behind it in sort of the development management proposals is that, and very much our advice from Hearts Ecology has been, you know, throughout the process in terms of looking at particular, whether it's protected species or other sort of what ecological assets within sites, that obviously we have adherence to sort of national guidelines, whether it's the EA or Natural England, but we don't feel that they need to be specifically written in the plan per se, because when at the planning application stage we will consult these bodies, and we feel that you need to look at the local context and take into account sort of site-specific issues when determining that. So really we don't feel it's appropriate at this sort of strategic level to detail the precise buffer.
You disagree, Mr. Dodds?
Yes, sir. All the representations we've made on this plan are are questions of effectiveness and whether it's actually going to work, and that's based on practical experience. Now, in these such situations, if you don't specify a buffer width, then someone will create their own policy and squeeze right up to the edge of that priority habitat. Now, in the case of something like hedgerows, you've got a hedgerow, and if you make a statement in your plan here, like a suitable margin of complementary habitat to protect their connective function, if you don't specify what that is, the developer will have a very different view from what an ecologist would. And if you build, say for example, there's another local plan going on at the moment where an application is talking about, presented with exactly this statement, has suggested that 2 metres is an adequate buffer for the hedgerow in question, or the hedgerows throughout the site. Now, ecologically, you're not protecting that priority habitat. That priority habitat ceases to function as a priority habitat because theoretically you could have a house 2 metres one side and 2 metres the other. So, in the absence of policy, it just creates difficulty for the council as well, because they're constantly in a conflict situation whereby they're trying to justify a larger buffer The developer is trying to justify a smaller buffer, and I don't blame the developer. You know, they're just looking to get what they can out of the development. But you need clarity because, again, as with the biodiversity impact calculator, if you don't put a number to it, then it's not a policy. It's just an argument waiting to happen. And the question then becomes, what can you justify from an ecological sense that's consistent with NPPF? Now, then you look to guidance from Natural England and whoever it might be, and it takes some searching for. Again, with all these corridors, they say, you know, they might say a complementary buffer, but what is that complementary buffer? Now, again, the best, obviously, we're going to push for the largest complementary buffer we can for wildlife. But again, it has to be evidenced. So with the Natural England guidance talks about a 15-metre buffer for ancient woodlands, and that is in order to allow the trees to achieve their natural growth height, etc. So if you build within that 15-metre buffer, then you're potentially impinging on root systems and inhibiting the natural development of that woodland. Well, why doesn't the same apply to hedges? Because part of the component ecological, if you want that hedgerow to achieve its full ecological functionality, then trees are a natural part of that. So if you allow for the trees to develop to then some trees, not all of the trees, some trees, standard trees within that hedgerow to develop to the natural state, that would infer that a 15-metre buffer is appropriate. And then I know the Environment Agency will stipulate that an 8-metre buffer to their watercourses is sort of like a minimum dimension, but we would argue that if you're justifying 15 metres for one priority habitat, then you should really justify 15 metres for another priority habitat. And we think that that would lead to a clearer picture for developers. They know that there's a clear red line that they mustn't go beyond. It makes things more simple for them. It adds they're not then in a conflict situation. They know that there's a level playing field. Everybody has to adhere to this standard. And it's ecologically justifiable, and it's more likely to work than a 2-metre buffer to a hedge, which is what the situation they will be presented with.
Is your 15 metres a no development buffer, or is it 15 metres outside of residential arrangements?
I would say that a 15-metre buffer would be purely for wildlife purposes. So it would a buffer for that habitat for that habitat to function effectively. It should be buffered by 50 metres of complementary habitat.
Council want to come back?
Yeah, yeah, we're aware of the guidance on sort of ancient woodland, and I think it really comes down to this sort of level of prescriptiveness, really. I mean, the NPPF sort of advises against being too prescriptive, and our policy, for example, on ancient woodland seeks to protect ancient woodland, so we don't see the prescription of a detailed buffer set out in the local plan is necessary to achieve that aim. The guidance would be followed at the planning application stage. So I think, yeah, I don't think we need to be that prescriptive in the local plan to achieve the gain of, you know, the ultimate goal, which we concur with, is to protect sort of key assets of ecological importance. I mean, we could potentially put extra supporting text in referencing the need to follow particular guidance, you know, but then you do have the danger of you could have a wish list and a long supporting text. But, you know, we're not opposed. Clearly, we want to achieve that sort of wildlife buffers in new development. And we have actually proposed a modification in the supporting text which sort of emphasises the importance of wildlife corridors. We just haven't gone as far as sort of specifying a particular width.
Yeah. Do you want to come back?
I think if you don't, you're just storing up trouble for yourselves, because you'll constantly be in this conflict situation, because that's what happens now. And you can, if you've got an opportunity now to make your lives a lot easier and avoid conflict in the future, and it's justifiable ecologically, so why wouldn't you take it?
Mr. Oakenthal?
Thanks, sir. Just to say that we're talking on the minimum, the 15 metre for ancient woodland for the woodland. Actually, if we were looking at the green corridor and that policy, having a 15 metre buffer would not fit with the corridor that actually we have existing at the moment. If it was written in that you take the minimum, then there is no movement. There is no movement to expand. If the green corridor is assessed, and the only way it can be assessed fully is if you know the baseline that you start with. As the Green Corridor Group, we've done studies which actually would show greater widths are needed rather than just going to the minimum standards that are set in the MPPF.
So actually, Mr. Dodds, how are you actually wanting SADM 16 changed?
I think I put that in my representation, and we suggested the policy as we would like to see it, and that basically states that rather than saying a suitable margin of complementary habitat, specify what that suitable margin of habitat actually is. I can see that only helping the policy, not hindering the policy, because a suitable margin, what's suitable for one person is entirely not suitable for another person. It adds clarity and makes the plan better and makes the plan effective, because at the moment it's, in our opinion, it's just not, it doesn't provide enough detail in this instance. The other thing I would add, sir, if you're worried about being prescriptive, they've been prescriptive in terms of the 8 metre buffer to watercourses. Why can't you do exactly the same to other priority habitats?
We put in that's in the supporting text rather than the policy. That's a proposed modification to the supporting text, just to set out what the Environment Agency recommends. And I mean, we could put something in the supporting well, we have already proposed to make some modifications to the supporting text. We haven't defined 15 metres, I think, and so that is an option. My understanding is that specifically relates to ancient woodlands, but there would be other habitats where you might want a wider buffer. And I think the concern was that if we sort of suggested 15 metres, that might mean that that's what we always get. Whereas I think there is a need to look at the habitat in question and what the appropriate buffer is, if that makes sense.
You're quite right. That is the problem of setting a minimum distance. But at the moment, there's no minimum distance. If you leave, as I said, an absence of policy creates a vacuum, and then you will have your terms dictated to you by developers. This way, you have at least some protection, because they won't err on the side of extra habitat for, connective habitat for wildlife. They'll err on the minimum, and this creates at least your red line. And if you say it is a minimum, then there is the potential there to expand it. For example, in the instance of the Green Corridor through the Birchall development. So I can't see it being anything other than helpful to you.
In terms of C, local wildlife sites, other habitats, species and ecological assets of local importance, and it goes on. Do you basically include everything in that's currently got wildlife associated with it?
No, sir. Priority habitats are defined by the NERC Act, and they are things, in the instance of most development, they will be hedgerows, there will be high quality grassland, ancient woodland, ponds, etc. So they have a specific definition, and they are the critical natural assets of the wider countryside. So it's only those that we're looking to protect and buffer. And bear in mind, MPPF says conserve and enhance biodiversity. So these are the critical critical environmental assets that we have. if you erode that by putting something 2 metres from it, it ceases to become a priority habitat. So it doesn't matter how many times you say in your document that we are conserving and enhancing biodiversity, you're not, because the policy isn't there to enable you to do it.
Okay, but hedgerows presumably have to be hedgerows that have got a reasonable diversity of species and have been, well, not maintained as some hedgerows on agricultural land are currently maintained. Is that right? Or
Yeah,
is it conserving all hedgerows per se?
The definition of hedgerow is again defined in terms of you have certain species richness of hedgerow, you get more important hedgerows than other hedgerows, yes, but the hedgerow regulations defines what is an important hedgerow or a hedgerow, but the priority habitat itself is explained. So for example, a hornbeam hedge wouldn't qualify as a priority habitat, it has to be defined. But hedgerows, say for example, poorer quality hedgerows that have been very badly maintained from an ecological perspective on agricultural land, whilst at the moment might not provide much of an ecological function, but if they're managed differently, often due to their age, you're talking about, you know, communities, ecological communities that are hundreds of years old potentially, if you start to manage them differently, all of a sudden their function would change dramatically.
Yeah, I'm just conscious though of having sort of 30-metre strips, 15 either side of a hedge. If you have an area of agricultural land where, if you like, the farmer's not been as diligent as some have and ripped them all out over the last 50 years, you won't have much land left to develop on if you've got 30-metre strips all over the place.
Well, there's an obligation to have an enhanced priority habitat. So that's in the MPF already. It's to the extent at which you do that, and that's what I'm trying to establish is if you're going to conserve and enhance, you have to think about the holistic environment that is dependent on that hedge. You're right, you've got different standards of hedge. You can have a skinny little thing that's been chopped off at 1 foot that hasn't got much ecological value. Absolutely, but it still counts as a priority habitat, so the developer already has to take that into consideration. All I'm trying to do is to establish the parameters to the extent of which he has to do that in order to conserve and enhance biodiversity, not just pay lip service to the MPPF.
Yeah, but the MPPF doesn't rule out development associated with the things that are in B here, does it? And I mean, the policy actually says the need for and benefits of development significantly outweigh the loss of the harm, which is what the MPPF says.
You're absolutely right, sir, and I wouldn't disagree with that at all. You know, I'm not naive enough to think that all priority habitats are absolutely defended, or ancient woodland, or anything is sacrosanct from development, ultimately, if it's in the public interest. But that's where the biodiversity impact calculator would come in, because if it's deemed necessary for the development, for the functionality of the development, that you lose that hedgerow, then it has to be compensated in a meaningful and measurable way. So if it's a poor quality hedgerow, you will have to replace it maybe 1-to-1. If it's a high quality hedgerow, then you'll maybe have to replace it by providing 5 times, or whatever it might be. I'm picking these figures off the top of my head. The point is, it has to be measurable. If for net gain to biodiversity or conserving and to mean anything, you have to measure it. Which brings us back to the calculator, but at the same time, it is relevant with protection of priority habitats, because if you're going to provide for the protection of them, then you have to have the functionality within your local plan to do that to a meaningful way, which I would argue is the buffer.
Okay. You've offered to look at putting something that's
We've already put something in the supporting text. I think what we could do is to add reference to the 15-metre buffer for, in the case of ancient woodlands, and then perhaps make reference to other habitats might need a wider buffer, which I think would make the point that you're trying. Would address the issue.
I would be more than happy, or we would be more than happy, if it went in the supporting text, because it would then just add clarity to the policy itself, which I think is okay, but it needs that. It needs people to be clear as to what that actually means, because, as I said, the less definitive you are, the more problems you'll get down the line.
Okay. Does that bring us on to 110? Are the requirements for protected species surveys and any required mitigation adequately covered? Mm, 111 is probably linked to it, actually. Sorry, yeah.
Again, as with all our input into this, I hope this is to add more clarity. I think that although I see the council have made changes to the policy, I think it would be clearer if it was set out a little bit more definitively as to what actually is required. For example, one of the problems I see when looking at planning applications, and this is routine, is that ecological surveys, although they're required to do this in terms of planning applications, when it comes to things like protected species, they neglect to put in answers to the 3 tests of the European Protected Species Mitigation Licence. That's a requirement that the council has to consider. It's a duty under the Conservation of Habitats regulations, and that's routinely not put in there. So it just adds. It means that development or applications can go through planning a little bit more easily if they know exactly what they need to provide. Because although they should do, they don't generally provide it. So it just adds just a bit more clarity. And again, I would be happy for it to go in a supporting text, but it will just make the council's job easier, I think.
Does the council agree or disagree?
We're happy to put something in the supporting text. I think what we don't want to do is to add loads and loads of text to the supporting text, because it then becomes quite unwieldy. We do also set out our requirements in the validation checklist, which is advice given to prospective applicants about the information that needs to accompany a planning application. And I think it's most useful there, because that's where people hopefully tend to look at what they need to provide when they're submitting a planning application. But we can certainly look at adding or boosting up what's in the supporting text to make that point.
Sorry, just quickly. Yes, I don't care where it goes, as long as it's in there. And as I said, it make your job easier. That the validation checklist doesn't, at the moment, say that mitigation compensation measures must be definitively stated and illustrated on plans, and answers to the 3 tests of the European Protected Species Licence are required. I say that 3-4 times a day to ecological reports that are submitted, and that's something that you need to make, because if you make decisions and you haven't had reference, for example, to the 3 tests, your decisions can be challenged, and there's precedent for that. So why cause a problem when you don't need to? This makes your plan better.
I think it was more of a clarity issue in terms of the policies map, and we've just made a change.
No, only to say that the changes that we recommended yesterday should be incorporated in the changes. And specifically, your text, revised text, needs changing in the light of what we discussed yesterday.
Yeah, given that these issues are cropping up with regards to a number of policies, it might be worth thinking long and hard as to, which policy is most appropriate to actually make changes to. There's not a lot of point doing it 3 times over if you're putting things in supporting text. It really only needs to be said once. Should the plan contain a tree strategy? Anybody want to say anything?
Purely for the sake of clarity, we do have one for the council and the trees that we manage and the trees that... the council does have a tree strategy to manage its own trees and to give guidance on how everyone else should manage the trees that they are responsible for, so that does exist and forms part of our management of the borough and its environment.
Okay. Should there be reference to landscape and visual impact assessments within the policy? I mean, this is almost the same as the habitats calculator, isn't it? Only looking at something else. Mr. Zukowski.
I would fairly strongly argue that landscape and visual impact assessment should be within the policy. It's a fairly critical component of assessing the visual impact of a development, and indeed one that the council relied on fairly strongly when it came to addressing the rather controversial new Barnfield incinerator proposal. It was fairly clear that in terms of understanding impact on heritage assets of developments that have a potential visual impact on the setting of those assets, that actually the landscape and visual impact assessment is a fairly critical tool to enable you to make an informed judgment as to what the impact is.
What's Council's view on that?
The policy already says that proposals will be assessed for their impact on landscape features to ensure that they conserve or improve the prevailing landscape quality, character and condition. We have proposed to add something to the supporting text to specifically refer to landscape visual impact assessments, but we think the policy wording itself is fine as it is.
Okay. I mean, a health warning on landscape and visual impact assessments is that I have yet to do an appeal, I think, when we have had 2 landscape visual impact assessments from opposing parties and they have both said the same thing. Mr. O'Leary?
Yeah. Just a question. In the council's response, it does say that agrees that a reference to landscape and visual impact assessments would be helpful in the supporting text. What does that mean? Does that mean that there will be situations where there will be requirements for a landscape and visual impact assessment, or what does it mean? There's words in the supporting text. I'm trying to understand the meaning of those.
Ms. Tiley?
Well, it just means that in order to provide the supporting evidence the applicant would need to provide evidence on the impact on landscape features, and a landscape visual impact assessment might be an appropriate way to do so, and they would be required to submit that as part of the supporting information to accompany their planning application.
So I'm guessing, is there a trigger for that? What would be the trigger? Would that I assume that wouldn't apply to all applications, but it might. There'd be a trigger in terms of locality, or
We haven't set out a trigger as such, but I suppose it would. It relates to the development, so I think it's difficult to be prescriptive.
I'm just thinking in terms of the green corridor and the proximity of heritage assets as an example. How would that get thought through as needing to apply in a particular situation because of locality, of proximity to significance and significance of heritage assets?
Well, a development like Birchall Garden Suburb is likely to require an environmental impact assessment, and I would imagine that a landscape visual impact assessment might well be part of the requirements to accompany that planning application, as well as an impact assessment on heritage. So you would need to go through a whole raft of impact assessments to look at the environmental impact of a specific proposal.
Okay. And then final one, should landscape character areas be referred to as environmental assets? You've actually suggested a slight modification to the policy, or to the supporting text. Does anybody disagree with what's been suggested? All right. It's ADM 17, urban open land. First question is, what's the intended status of urban open land? The council have answered it in their statement. Would you like to just briefly summarise what you're saying there?
Well, basically, we're saying that open space is an important concept, key to the character of both Welwyn Garden City and Hatfield. It's a designation which exists in the current local plan, and it is one that we want to see rolled forward to the new local plan to identify those really important areas of open land in the urban area which need to be protected.
Okay, does anybody here wants to say anything about it? Yeah, Mr. Zagowski.
I have some significant concerns at the agreed statements of common ground that looks to modify the policy wording. There's a relationship with Howdale School as an exemplar of that, but I think that the addition of the item from HCC may make the policy inappropriate in terms of delivering a policy for urban open land, and therefore may make the plan unsound. The grounds for that are that the proposed modification that's in the statements of common ground changes the assessment of what appropriate development might be on urban open land, and prescribes what should be, in my opinion, a planning balance decision as to whether a development is acceptable or not. And what it does is allow urban open land to be effectively rubber stamped for loss if an educational establishment wishes to expand. And I think that's not appropriate in terms of trying to define a policy for protection of urban open land.
Could someone from the council say whether he's got that right? I mean, I'm not aware that you're actually changing the actual policy.
Yeah. So yes. So I think we're obviously looking at question 120 here in specific.
Yeah, well, forget that. I mean, that might be how the boundaries have been drawn rather than what the policy's saying in principle.
Yeah. Okay. So the wording of the policy. I mean, Councillor Zagowski is right that in discussion since submission of the plan with the county council, seeking to address a particular objection, we've also sort of covered the issue of the need for some flexibility in urban open land policy to allow, in specific and well evidenced instances, for the enlargement of school establishments into what is normally the playing field areas, which may be designated as areas of urban open land. That has been subject to some fairly detailed discussion, and as has been said, is reflected in the statement of common ground between us, which is EX56, so the examination documents. Looking at the wording precisely of the policy, which is the proposed amendment to the policy, which is set out on page 30, of our statement, and at point C to question 120. What we're saying there, if I could briefly just read it out, probably for clarity, we're adding in an extra criterion to the policy that says where development is education development associated with the delivery of school facilities required to meet the evidence need for additional school places, where it can be demonstrated that the impact on the urban open land has been reduced to the minimum possible, and where the provisions of criterion 3 of the policy have been met. So it's taken what was an original objection based on specifics from the County Council. We've had a wider discussion with them. We think there is justification for making that modification to policy, as we are, and it is a very particular and sort of relies on evidence modification to the policy. So we do believe, in the context of the local plan strategy as a whole and delivery of the necessary education facilities to support growth, it is an appropriate modification to make.
You want to come back?
I do want to come back, because what unfortunately is not clear from that is that the way that the policy is currently worded, were the County Council to come forward with a proposal for for example, a secondary school site that was wholly and completely on urban open land, and indeed took up the entirety of that urban open land, they may decide that they would that was an appropriate approach to delivering school need, and the way that the policy is currently phrased, they would have a planning justification for losing that in the entirety of that urban open land parcel, and there would be nothing that the Borough Council could do to prevent that, because their exception as written allows no other planning decision to be arrived at. I think it's a really ill-informed wording and structure for that, and I think I don't disagree that there should be within the plan potentially reference to other needs overriding the designation of a plot of land as urban open land, but that should be part of a planning balance decision, and not enshrined in policy that the County Council, as education authority, can simply override the designation in that way. I think it's inappropriate.
But is there not a difference between urban land in the context of public parks, playing fields, etc., and school sites, and in terms of, if you like, the loss of the school site open land, using it for educational purposes, expanding a site onto part of a playing field, for example, is totally different than the school no longer having a need, and so it's abandoned and closed down, and the authority wants to sell what is urban open land, and mostly open and maybe even used by local people for recreational purposes, for housing development or whatever.
I think there is a difference there, but I also think that the appropriate conduit for that decision should be the planning balance, rather than an enshrining in policy that you can simply just go and do this.
But who's going to do the planning balance?
Well,
because you don't get the applications.
We don't, but it comes to a development control committee, and that body makes a decision as to whether the planning balance is one direction or the other. Now, there are, I think, a separate argument as to whether that process is actually effective, but I think that enshrining in policy that that urban open land can simply be developed upon by the county council without further recourse to the designation of that land isn't appropriate.
Mr. Wood, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, sir. Matt Wood, representing HCC Services. I think, just to clarify, I don't think the proposed, the planning authority can say better than me, but I don't think the proposed amendment to the policy is intended to be the sort of carte blanche that Mr. Zakowski is worried about. I think, to reassure him, my understanding is that what the additional criteria does is to enable some flexibility in relation to the urban open land designation, and for the acceptability of any proposal upon urban open land to be cross-referenced to two other policies contained within the plan, which contain tests which need to be satisfied as part of the planning balance in terms of determining whether a particular proposal for development is acceptable. And from a service provision perspective, that amendment to the policy was considered, or is considered, to be helpful insofar as the urban open land designation washes over very many primary schools across the borough, and in terms of the educational requirements that flow from the submitted plan, representations have been made by HCC to identify that there's a need to be able to expand existing school sites, and from a service provision perspective, the proposed amendment was considered to overcome the original objection that was made by HCC to the way the policy was worded. So, in summary, I don't think, the planning authority, as I say, can comment better than me, but I don't think the proposed rewording of the policy gives the sort of carte blanche that Mr. Zakowski is worried about.
But I would respond that whilst there may not be an intent to do that, what we're looking at here is what the policy actually says. And what the policy actually says is that the designation of urban open land can be overridden with the production of evidence that a school site is needed. Now, I don't think that that's appropriate. I think that the local education authority ought to be, like any other developer, producing evidence that should go into a planning balance to offset the designation of a particular area of land. And I don't understand why the HCC as a neighbouring council should be given preference and priority at a policy level like this, without some further sort of constraints or conditions. And I think it's potentially purely the policy wording that I have a problem with, that I think is inappropriate.
What's your understanding of the function of urban open land?
It's to provide open space, open gaps between developed form and so on. And I think that's what the definition in the policy is.
So it's not, in your view, and presumably the councils, not just to protect land that the public uses for open space purposes. Allotments, playing fields. A lot of parts of the country, this becomes an issue where educational playing fields are used by the community on a joint basis, but I don't know if that's the case here or not.
Well, there are examples where community uses are combined with other uses, and clearly there are a range of urban open land parcels that have more or less contribution to a community. But I think that a designation of urban open land means that there should be some protections in place on that space. And that we shouldn't have a preferential treatment of a particular alternative use for that, which is what this policy text would enshrine.
It's not really an alternative use, is it?
Sorry?
I mean, the site's presumably acquired for educational purposes, and they're not considering selling a third of it off for a housing estate or an employment site. They're building an extension to a school, presumably.
Well, I think there's justification as to why you might want to, at the planning stage, put forward an application that suggests a change of use of that land. And I completely agree that if the Education Authority produce an application that is evidenced as to why development on urban open land in that situation is appropriate, that application shouldn't progress. My argument is that actually enshrining if you like, a buy on the urban open land designation to be able to overcome that designation without any further control is not appropriate.
But surely, unless there was a proven need for extra classroom space or whatever it happens to be, they wouldn't be doing it.
Well, I think that actually goes to another question as to what the sort of primary driver behind an application coming forward is. But the examples that I could use, and I think we may be going on to one very shortly, there is a question mark in my mind. I mean, what is the determined need threshold here? If we need one extra space, is the county council able to proceed with an application? Well, it would appear so from the way the policy is worded, which seems, again, you know, inappropriate.
But in reality, that wouldn't happen, would it? I mean, if you've only got a need for one extra school place, you don't get funding through the Department of Education, presumably, to build new classrooms.
Well, this starts to go on to the issues around the open land at Howdell School.
Well,
because
we'll leave them anyway, do you want to come back, Mr. Wood?
I was only going to say, sir, that in terms of any planning application for a school expansion or for school-related development, any such application would usually be accompanied by evidence of need associated with that proposal. So whether it's, I don't know, a temporary bulge in demand that necessitates provision of a mobile classroom for a 7-year period, or whether it's some longer-term demographic trend that's pointing to a need to provide permanent expansion.
I mean, does the council have an official view on this? Has it actually been formally considered? What is it?
Sorry, so has what been formally?
Well, the policy as it is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously, well, I'm assuming some difference of opinion between Councillor Zukoski and the majority of people who voted on this, if that's where it went.
Right.
Shall I just?
Yeah.
If I address this, the proposed modification hasn't been to our members,
Right,
so it is a modification. It's designed to address an issue. We are aware that a number of schools will need to be expanded to accommodate the levels of growth that are being brought forward through the local plan. It is an issue which crops up quite frequently, the conflict between the urban open land designations and the need to expand existing schools, which needs to be addressed. I think what we wanted to ensure through the policy wording, that firstly the proposal had to relate to the need for additional school places, so it wasn't just about managing the county council portfolio and perhaps selling a site for housing in order to invest in other services, that it needed to relate to an actual need for additional school places. Secondly, that they would have to demonstrate that in deciding how the extension is to be designed, that it had the effect of minimising the impact on the urban open land. And lastly, that the provisions of criterion 3 were satisfied, and criterion 3 relates to there being no loss or net reduction in the size of any playing fields or community recreation facilities, which I think would address your concern about a new school being on urban open land. I don't, that would prevent that happening.
Well, it would if the urban open land was playing fields or recreation facilities, but not if it was any other form of urban open land. And your policy quite clearly says that one of the things that you expect urban open land to contribute to is the breaks and gaps in urban form. And actually, that was the point I was trying to make, that actually that delivery of that is compromised by the proposed text that you've put down. Because if there is a need demonstrated that that entire urban open land space is turned to built form, it basically closes any sort of gap without there being a policy test that has to be overcome for that development to go ahead.
I'm just sort of thinking of the types of urban open land which we've got designated for that specific purpose. I'm not aware that any that would be large enough for, to locate a new school, but I mean what we could do is to add in another criterion relating to the primary function of the urban open land, or compromise the reason for its designation.
As I say, I'm just very nervous about this whole thing because I don't think it's been particularly well considered in terms of what its impact is on the urban form of the borough and its potential implications in terms of what the Education Authority might decide to do. And as I say, we will come on to Howdale School and the issues around that in the next question, but it has, I think, pertinence to this. Personally, my view is that the policy, as proposed to be amended, is not sound.
Why?
I believe it's not sound because it fails to provide adequate protection for urban open land as designated in the policy. And it doesn't do that because it undermines it for a particular developer, basically taking away that protection.
But the amendment's part of the policy, and it's changing the policy and changing the way land can be lost from urban open land. But how does that make it unsound?
Well, because
that's what they want to do as a council. What's wrong with it?
The issue goes, I suppose, to what urban open land is designed for and what urban open land designation is designed to do. And I think what the change in the policy fails to address is how protection can be overridden and how it's actually delivered on the ground. The policy is quite clear that urban open land is supposed to be there to protect residents' environment and amenity, and I think the way that the policy has been amended, that protection is eroded and undermined, and I think that makes the plan unsound because it's not producing policies that are delivering an environment that residents would expect.
All right, well, why is it contrary to national policy, for example? Is it contrary to national policy?
I'm uncertain of us. I would need to look at...
I wouldn't think it was.
Okay.
So, why has this not been positively prepared? They looked at a balance of arguments and directions and come to a conclusion. Is that conclusion just totally unreasonable?
Well, in terms of the balance of arguments,
need for development sites to demonstrate that they're having regard to the promotion of sustainable means of travel. Mr. Morley wanted strategic routes. You were going to discuss that, I think, with the county council. Is that right?
We thought that by the time we move to the end of the plan, that there might be something that we could put in the infrastructure delivery plan,
right.
In terms of where we've got to with regards to the growth and transport plan. Just the programme thereon will mean that there'll be more certainty on specific proposals.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he wanted strategic cycle routes. I'm not sure how feasible that is, really, but it's just a map for you to look at that. And then the other matter I've got on transport was the policy on rural roads and development, and can you kind of look at whether or not in a different guise that could come back in. I mean, it quite clearly can't be used as a rod to beat any development in the green belt, because it's going to increase capacity on rural roads, which it inevitably would do, which I suspect is where people are coming from. But I mean, there is a point in terms of some of the rural roads. And let's take, for example, south of Essendon, for example. I mean, you wouldn't want development there, without major improvements to them. And I don't suppose you're going to have development anyway.
No, I think that's probably why the policy hasn't been used in the past, because of the green belt designation, and that would continue to provide protection, apart from those areas which are proposed for release for development. But I mean, I think we could look at whether we feel we could add something into one of the policies. Or not.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on transport? Right, housing. Yes, I did. I was hoping to read through the evidence that had been submitted on behalf of them, and I've not had opportunity, unfortunately, but I will do that. Right, housing SP7. You were going to look again at accessible and adaptable dwellings as a result of what?
Been in contact with the representative already to ask for the evidence that she has. She's not come back to us as of yet.
Okay.
But yeah, we'll look at that again.
And then there was a point on gypsy and travellers.
Yeah, the point on gypsy and travellers was you asked us to either insert or do a short addendum just to say what the participation rates were for the
Oh yeah, because
survey.
he was saying that they were really low, and from what you were telling me yesterday,
they weren't.
They were all right.
Yeah,
well, they're better than lots of people get.
Absolutely. So I'll see if I can either insert it into the document itself. If that's not possible because it's all PDF'd, then I'll do a small addendum. But yeah, we'll get those participation rates sorted.
Yeah. Were you meant to be doing something on housing for older people? Oh, yeah. I think he had some numbers in, 715, 725, and they were arguing about what it was. In some ways it might be better just to put more than 700. Then it can be anything.
I don't recall debating this, but the OAN included an assessment of the proportion of housing that would be needed for older people. The figure in the policy at the moment is based on a previous SMAR. It's been updated recently. It's a small increase, I think. So we proposed a modification just to that number in the plan.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, is that?
Yeah. Well, if it's going to keep changing, why not just put more than 700?
Oh, okay.
Because it's not going to go below.
Yeah, okay.
And if it goes to 750 or 800, then you can put more than 750. But I'm never a believer in being precise in those sorts of things, because it never works out as it says.
No. Well, perhaps we should do the same then with the C2s, because that's got a precise figure in it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think you're looking at C2s, aren't you, through this review of the objective assessed housing need?
No.
Was that the accommodation needs for younger people and student housing? Was that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
I was just referring to the communal housing for older people.
All right. Well, both of them really, because the more of that there is, the less you need to be providing other dwellings for them.
So the only other matter I just wanted to raise with you is whereas over the last 2 days you skipped through each question one by one, on Tuesday we didn't necessarily do that, and so there was a modification we'd proposed around self-build. Now we didn't have any representations on it, but we're conscious that we're not currently meeting our duty because the policy doesn't really bite enough. So I just wanted to sort of raise with you now on record that we did propose a modification to
No,
that.
it's fine.
And it's okay.
Yeah, if I didn't think what you were saying in response wasn't the right thing to say, I would have said something. Right. So, economy. Were there any changes on that? I think I said bring the issues that weren't resolved about Woolmer Green. That's right, to the site development, you know, all the discussion about the village.
Yes, yes.
There was no change to the 3-year, 1 year, was there?
Yeah.
I think, no.
No, no. On place, sorry. On placemaking, if I've written it down correctly, Gascoigne Settle we're going to provide you with some words retail buildings. And that, well, it might be taken forward into the master planning guidance.
Words around the need to have a vision set up, design vision to be set out in the master plans.
Yeah. Got anything else down on placemaking? Oh. I've got. What's on SDM, SADM 12?
You didn't feel that criteria 2 read very well, and you asked us to revisit
that's right,
that.
yeah.
That was just how it read grammatically here.
Yeah. And I've not got anything else until flood risk then. Okay. What I've got down there is look at the potential for inserting something about flood risk off-site, so it's more clear. Downstream flooding, yeah. There's nothing else now before SP11, protection enhancement of critical environmental assets, is there?
SP11, I've got a note on tables 7 and 8.
That's right. Yeah.
With a reference to non-designated heritage assets.
you're going to relook at the text about locally designated assets, and then you're going to change tables 7 and 8.
That's correct, sir.
That's what I've got. Oh, and you were just going to check with Historic England that something was right. Is that right?
That's correct. So yes, that was that was SADM 15, if I remember correctly. The changes to SADM 15, which were proposed post signing our MOU.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Question 75 that we agreed to liaise with Arts County Council.
I think that's to do with the archaeological assessment and the potential for assets.
And if we move on to, is biodiversity next on your list?
This relates to another Gascoigne-Cecil point about the importance of the historic environment to quality of life. I think they were going to send me something, and then I'd consider whether it could go in somewhere.
Right. On biodiversity, is that what you've got next? You got biodiversity next. I've not got anything before then.
One more issue where you questioned whether we had the policy order incorrect.
Oh.
And whether or not SADM 15 should come after SP 11, and could we have a look at that?
The plan is not unsound.
No.
Okay, you can do it as you want.
Yes, I think we'll look at the structure to see if there can be a more logical flow and order.
Okay.
But
it does seem a bit odd, just speaking out of turn. But as I say, there are lots of ways you can do it, and it's ridiculous trying to be prescriptive about it. All right. So on biodiversity, you're going to relook at whether there needs to be an objective mechanism to assess the achievement of net gains to biodiversity. That was in response to that long discussion we had with the wildlife guy.
Sorry, I think my note is that you suggested that we made a note in the supporting text around the need for empirical assessment.
Yeah, or whatever. And then the next thing is the MIM room, and you're going to put look at putting something in the supporting text.
Yes, I think some of the mods we've already proposed, which would make reference to the Water Framework Directive and the River Thames Basin Management Plan, and I thought there would be an opportunity there just to refer to the MIMRAM's importance, which I think satisfied the objection.
Yeah. Right, have you got anything else on protection of the assets? Nope.
I think that the only thing was, in terms of SADM 15, was to include some supporting text on setting and the importance of setting.
Oh, yes, I forgot that. Yes, yeah.
There were also...
I never ever thought of that being an issue historically. You know, I thought everybody realised that setting and listing buildings was, you know, the context of the building, you know, not because, oh, well, the setting's a nice piece of land, therefore we'll protect that.
In relation to Saddam 16, weren't there a couple this morning as well?
Yeah, we've not got to this morning yet.
Okay, that's fine.
I think we're there now, aren't we? All right. Right, on the green corridor you were going to look at putting some minimum width like 50 metres or whatever, and whatever needs to be put in the supporting text to tell the development industry that it's not sort of a race to the bottom.
Yes, sir. Do you think minimum width needs to be in the policy, or could it be in the
It's going to be in the
supporting
supporting text. I think the heritage changes were the same as were discussed the previous day, and it's really a matter for you whether you put it in the main policy or one of the subsidiary policies. It probably depends what it is and where it best fits. I read my own writing. I put something in about Saddam 15.
Would that be the bit about setting, sir? I mean, we did discuss a number of the changes on the previous day, and I think today we just talked about setting was the only thing I think we added today as a change.
Setting. Yeah, you're probably right. It would make sense then. And then in Saddam 16 you were going to put something in to address questions 105 and 106 in terms of measuring net gains to biodiversity. That's similar to what we talked about yesterday, isn't it? Again about
Yes, I think it's the same
thing again. Just decide which one it goes in. I've not got anything else.
I think there was something around, we had a bit of a conversation about whether we needed to be specific about 15-metre buffer to wildlife sites, and I think...
Oh, there's that, yeah.
And I think what we agreed to do was to make reference to it, but to also indicate that a buffer strip could be wider, and just to put something in the supporting text to give that dimension. I think that was right.
Yeah.
We talked about putting something in the policy about wildlife buffers, or was that not decided?
Talked about it, but I think the conclusion was that we'd put something in the supporting text in a similar way.
Buffer strips info in supporting text. Yeah, forgot that was there. And were you going to change Saddam 17, the education use of urban open land?
Urban open land, yeah. Well, we've proposed this additional criteria. I think in the light of what Councillor Ecological was referring to, concern that that criterion could potentially be misused. I mean, I think what we might want to do is just to see if we could tighten it up a little bit to rule out any interpretations that we didn't intend. But we haven't proposed
anything.
They don't
just give themselves planning permission anyway.
Well, they do.
Sorry to be pessimistic about this.
I think they do, sir. And
but they would be very different from county councils that I've experienced.
No, they do, and I think that criterion reflects what actually happens on the ground. But hopefully, it was giving them some criteria which they would need to use in order to justify the extension and to make sure they'd gone through a specific approach, or at least they would need to demonstrate that at committee when such applications were considered.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing you want, though, is a policy that's going to effectively stop them expanding primary schools.
Precisely so.
It's just...
That's why we came to that accommodation, recognised that particularly with levels of growth that they would need to expand existing schools, and we needed to find a way to both protect the integrity of urban open land but allow them to expand.
Okay, yeah. The next one I've got City Park. I'll go and look at that when we get to sites. I imagine I'll have some site visits to do. I'll not do it now. If for whatever reason I don't do it, then remind me, please.
It's quite a complicated site, isn't it? So in as much as the appeal decision doesn't affect the whole of the open land designation, it only affects part of it. So if you need a plan to perhaps show you what part of the decision that was made on appeal affects,
all right, well, look, in the
can
fullness of
provide
time,
that.
let me have a plan, but
Yeah.
it's not vital that you do it in the next month.
Okay.
You do it in the next 6 months.
Wheel us back to the debate on Ellenbrook. I think we've missed one.
Is this the
Yeah, there was, so we've whizzed past this one. This was your comment that figure 14 didn't seem to align with figure 8.
Oh, that's right, doesn't.
And could we have a look at that?
Yeah, it doesn't.
And there was also some debate around whether it's a country park or not, and should it be called a country park? And
what's in a word?
That's the issue. Yeah. There's no easy answer to that one, unfortunately. It's become...
Are they the people that want an enormous area of land between Hatfield and St Albans releasing for development?
Yes.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
And they would, as part of relating that development, provide presumably improvements to this country park in St Albans district. Is that right?
And in...
Oh, there's bits in yours, isn't there?
And a bit in ours as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's all about, yes, how about the enhanced park that, albeit reduced in size significantly, that Mr.
Oh, do you want the
Maddox
building part of the park?
Yes, yeah.
Ah, right.
Yes,
but
yeah.
Yeah, and the park came out of some minerals operation. Is that right?
The park arose out of, as part of the 106, with the redevelopment of Hatfield Aerodrome, Business Park, etc., which took place starting in 2001, and is still just a bit left to do. So it arises from there. It was always known there was going to be, well, I say always known, it was always expected there will be mineral extraction there because it was in one of the county council's preferred areas. Now we're in a situation where that mineral application has been approved by the county council subject to completion of section 106 variations relating to the original 106 as well as new matters. So there's an ongoing discussion with Mr. Maddox's clients as well as with St Albans and the county council about the long-term management and arrangements for the park, which is open, but there's more work to do in terms of fully bringing it forward as a country park and handing it over to a trust who will then manage it in the longer term. If that makes sense. It's a bit of a complicated one, but...
So in response to question 99, I think we acknowledged that the modification made was subject following the completion of the MOU or the Statement of Common Ground with Historic England. So you were going to agree with Historic England. The mod there. And then... there was reference to this matter around the European Protected Species Licence and us making a modification in the supporting text because Mr. Dodds didn't feel the validation checklist made that requirement. And then the other one I've got before we move on again is in response to question 115, some revised text around the Water Framework Directive and the River Basin Management Plan. Could have been a debate we had the day before. But
yeah, that's the same mod we've got on the water environment in reference to the mineral.
And on the infrastructure, the only thing there I've got written down is the reference to cycling, but that probably will end up in the transport section anyway.
Yeah, so there's a question about, I think, whether that amendment under the transport policy, under SP4, should also be carried forward into SP13, which is the infrastructure delivery policy.
I think his point was that the two sections should be consistent. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's not a problem with that. I think you just had a concern you didn't want it to be overly long in terms of how we dealt with that.
And don't repeat things.
No,
just decide where's the best place to put it. And finally, you're going to look at forgot the chap's name now.
Mr. Adams.
Mr. Adams's revised policy. Yeah. This has been a public inquiry. People would be asking for adjournments and costs because of that. Right. I've not got anything else. Yeah, that's fine, yeah. One thing that crossed my mind the other day in relation to what was being discussed at Poundshanger, and I think I said, have a look at whether there's anywhere else you could relocate the airfield. I don't know what the score is sand and gravel workings and such the likes in Welling Hatfield, but I mean I do know that in Nottinghamshire there's always a problem of what you do with the site when you finish, and half of them end up being sort of nature reserves and sort of got ponds in there for wild birds and what have you to winter there or whatever. I don't know if there's any scope in the restoration of something like that to provide them with a site for a runway.
I don't think there's anywhere within Welling Hatfield. There may be in other Hertfordshire districts. The current Minerals Local Plan, the Regulation 18 stage with draft policies has just been out to consultation. Their Regulation 19 version is expected in the summer, and the allocated sites relate to sites around the west of Hatfield, or the proposed allocated sites relate to sites around west of Hatfield. So the Hatfield Aerodrome site, the one of the strategic sites, HAT1 SDS 5, I think it is, in our local plan, and then the Fursfield site, the Gypsy and Traveller site. So those are the three proposed sites in the emerging Minerals Local Plan. Sites which are currently being worked are in St Albans and East Herts.
So the sites, effectively, you'd have to be looking quite long term, because take the Hatfield Aerodrome minerals application, which we just mentioned, that estimated to complete and restoration by 2048 or something like that. So there's nowhere immediately at hand, I don't think, which offers the proximity in time to say, we could look. I mean, we'd obviously have a look, but
there probably isn't, the economic wherewithal to make it work. I don't know. I mean, Grant Shapps did say there's not been a new sort of non-military sort of airport developed, or an aviation facility for goodness knows how many years, which probably suggests they're not viable. But whether or not increased leisure time, increased wealth among certain sections of the population are making it viable, I don't know. It's really up for him to prove, isn't it? Really, that's not your job. So I tend to think it's not going away.
The only other thing you were going to do is to sort out about timescales for your questions for matters and issues for discussion at the next hearing session.
Yes. I'll try and get it all sorted out by Easter. Is that all right?
Yes, that would be helpful, certainly.
Yeah. So, have you got anything else? If not, thanks very much for participating. I hope it's not been too painful for you. Is it okay for me to come and use that room in the morning?
Ash is not available. We have a room guaranteed till 2 p.m. and I'm sure if you were to stay for past 2 we can find somewhere else to accommodate you if it means chucking some people out.
2 probably all right. It's just the hotel I'm staying in, it's a bit cramped on space, and I've got all the week's stuff to try and sort out before I go back. Sorry? Yeah, well, so I'll have to move out of there.
Just next door.
All right.
It's immediately next door.
Okay. Can I move in there tonight then? So it's the one nearest to reception, basically.
I can show you, it's no problem.
All right, great. Okay, yeah, if you do that, then we can move and go. All right. Thanks. Have a nice summer. Or early summer.